Right, well, I'm Ian Oddie, and this is my Metro 6R4 Replica. Very important, that piece.
So I can see, I don't think the inspiration for doing it needs explaining, but how do you go about building a Metro 6R4 from scratch? Because that's basically what you've done.
In effect, one of the biggest challenges is to actually find a Metro that's not rusty. That's harder than it sounds.
I know from conversations with Dan Elmore actually that you're quite a gifted engineer and quite modest about it.
I do a bit of engineering, so yeah, there's a lot more work than most people realise building a car. Yeah, it's not simple.
So from the planning stage, you've got a Metro shell. Obviously, you've then got to make decisions about your running gear and the layout and how you're going to do it. So if you could talk us through some of that process.
A lot of it starts with you've got to have a plan. You can't just go in blind, otherwise you end up doing everything twice or three times. And a lot of it really started from the front bulkhead where your pedals are. And I know that doesn't sound logical, but that's where the world starts, because then it sets your seat point, then it sets your rear bulkhead, which sets where your engine is, which sets where your gearbox is, and to try and get all that within the tailgate, that's distances. And you end up having to use a V6 because of the length. You couldn't get a V8 in without it sticking out the tailgate, so sort of dictates where things end up, really does that, if you want a sensible seating position.
You've gone down making it a realistic replica by making it mid-engined.
Yes.
Talk us through the engine and gearbox that you've used.
The engine is a Duratec V6. They're used in the Ford ST220, Jag X series. Obviously, Mazda do use them as well. Noble use them, which is also where you can get quite a lot of information for putting a turbo on and what bits you need to do and where you can go with the horsepower and things like that. But then to make it rear-wheel drive and put the engine the correct way around, in my opinion, longitudinal, you end up using a transaxle, and the most common ones of them are the Audi ones. So then you end up having to make an adapter plate and matching release bearings and clutches and things, and there's a bit of work in there, because once I turboed it, I started breaking gearboxes, and then I ended up putting a twin plate clutch into it and making that as well myself, because an engineering company, I'll not mention names, said it was impossible, so I had to make my own. Their answer was, well, reduce the power, and to me that's not an option.
So which Audi gearbox did you end up plumbing for?
Well, originally, when I first built the car, it was an 012, which is the smaller of the transaxles. In it now is an 01E, and it's got the JHM carbon synchros, it's got a limited slip gripper differential and things in it. So it's kind of bulletproof now. In hindsight, I should have done that originally, but of course, hindsight's wonderful, isn't it? You never know where you're going to stop with power, and power is like, so it's addictive, isn't it? You always want a bit more, and then you start breaking things, so.
Okay, that's brought us round to the engine. So talk us through the power and the turbo fitment and so on.
The current setup that's in it, it's got a GTX 3076 in it. On low boost, it's 3/4 of a bar, which is 11 or 12 psi. That makes 430 horsepower. Middle boost, I've got 3 boost settings. Middle boost is around 500 horsepower, which is 1.25 bar, and the full boost, which is 2 bar a boost, makes around 600. We couldn't get the numbers off the dyno because we couldn't stop the wheels spinning, but it goes quite well. But seldom do I use the higher boost levels unless there's a motorbike or something thinks he's quick.
And the suspension setup, because again, that's something that the layman doesn't really appreciate. Is quite a complicated thing to do from because it obviously can't be related in any way to the original Metro.
No, it isn't. I went for the original Metro had McPherson struts, which in the 80s everybody used, which is fine. But things have moved on. There's not that many cars, so that's got double A-arm suspension coilover, 2 1/4 inch coilovers all round, and I designed and built all that.
So as I said, a gifted engineer.
You only got to read a few books and watch YouTube, don't you, really?
So, what sort of time scale this you've done it all yourself, so
Yeah.
you're talking about, this is not a 5-minute job as well.
Fortunately, I'm self-employed, and I set out a plan a few years ago to just get stuck in and get it built and get it working. And originally it only had a standard engine, the standard gearbox, standard clutch and things, just get it working basically. And it took me about 7 months to do that. But that was a lot of hours. I was getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and working till 10 at night doing it to get it done. There is a lot of work in it.
Talk us through the paint, because it's a lovely colour.
It's actually a Ford red, and I do like red. Everything I've got is red. And believe it or not, I actually painted that in my back garden on a nice day in March a few years ago. It's not perfect. I call it a 1 metre paint job, but for me, it's not a show car. I use it, so it doesn't need to be perfect.
For a rally car, it looks absolutely resplendent.
Yeah,
so.
for a rally car, it's very good because they don't care either.
Obviously, having built the car, and it's absolutely stunning. How often do you get to use it?
If it's a nice day, I use it. I go shopping in it, I go to the post office, I go do track days, I do drag racing. I just use it. If it's really poor weather or the roads are covered in snow and ice and salt and things, no, it stays at home. But otherwise, I use it all the time.
And obviously, having designed the car, done all the all the design work on paper, and then constructed it. The first time you got in and drove it, what was the experience like? Because it's a new car. Was it anything like you anticipated?
I'll be absolutely honest. The first time down the road, it was terrible because when you build suspension, you don't know what geometry to put on and balance it up and what spring rates. You can do all the calculations you want with spring frequencies and things, but it really wasn't very nice to drive when I first drove it. But then perhaps having spent 7 months building it, the urge to just go out and just have a little drive of it probably overtook common sense and setting things up a little bit better than I should have done. So yeah, it wasn't very good first time, but it soon developed.
So you've now got it how you like it.
Yes, but I never stop. There's always something going on.
Well, that was going to bring me to my next question, sort of what are the plans going forward with the car, because these things evolve.
Minor things which will be on this week is a cold air intake and a knacker duct on the rear window for cold air. There'll be 2 3-inch scoops going in there, but longer term I'm going to go sequential, paddle shift, flat shifting, because I can and I want to, and it's a project. It's like my toy project is that it stops me getting bored. I get bored with normal things, So I like playing with things.
And is this sort of pride of the fleet, or I know that you're into model cars as well?
I do a lot of RC racing, but RC racing years ago was my hobby, but then it became a business. And when a hobby becomes a business, it kind of loses its hobbiness, isn't it? It's like it's not as much fun. So I still do that, and that is my business. So this is like the hobby to get away from the RC racing. I know people use RC racing to get away from their business, where I just do it the other way around, really. But I do a lot of RC racing even now.
The 6R4, the real one, with the four-wheel drive setup and so on, and the big diffs front and rear, can be quite a challenge to use, you know, in everyday driving. As a driving experience, I imagine this is actually quite relatively straightforward and docile.
It drives absolutely fine. Yes, it's not as quiet and as smooth as a modern car, but I've been in modern rally cars that are far worse than this. It drives, it changes, it'll do 35 miles to gallon if you keep your foot off it, which is really, really good. Cruising on the motorway. If you give it, you know, the beans, you're into single numbers, but you can't make horsepower from fresh air, so you've got to put some fuel in it. And
in terms of maintenance of the engine, I mean, obviously it's tuned up quite a bit. What sort of mileage do you get before you have to do any rebuilds? Or
I haven't rebuilt it yet, but in saying it's got all that horsepower, you're not using it all the time on the road. You wouldn't have a license for 5 minutes if you did, so really you're sort of tickling around. I expect it'll get to 10-20,000 miles before I need to put bearings and rings and things into it. And servicing, oil changes and things, that's the crux of most engines, and I do that religiously every 3,000 miles, period, no matter what it's done.
So thank you very much for letting us look at the car. It's absolutely fabulous.
No problem.